March 9, 1974. Lubang Island, Philippines. A young Japanese explorer named Norio Suzuki pushed through dense jungle vegetation, following a trail that might have been made by animals or might have been made by something else. He had been searching for 3 weeks. Most people thought he was insane. Suzuki had come to the Philippines looking for 3 things: a panda, a yeti, and a Japanese soldier who was still fighting World War II, 30 years after it had ended. He had found none of the first 2. But on this morning, as he rounded a bend near a small stream, he saw a figure standing in the shadows. The man was thin, weathered, dressed in a tattered uniform that might once have been Imperial Japanese Army issue. He held a rifle. The rifle was pointed directly at Suzuki. Suzuki slowly raised his hands and spoke in Japanese. "I'm not your enemy. I'm from Japan. The war is over." The man with the rifle did not lower it. He stared at Suzuki for a long moment, evaluating, calculating. Finally, he spoke. His voice was quiet but firm. "I am Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda of the Imperial Japanese Army. I'm still on duty. I will only surrender when I receive orders from my commanding officer." Suzuki had found what he was looking for. He had found a man who had been fighting a war that ended in 1945, who had survived in the jungle for 29 years, who had killed dozens of people, who had evaded capture by thousands of searchers, who had rejected every attempt to convince him the war was over. Suzuki had found a man living in 1944 while the rest of the world had moved to 1974. But finding Hiroo Onoda was the easy part. Convincing him to come home would require something no one had been able to provide: orders from a commanding officer who had been dead for years. The story begins 30 years earlier, in the final desperate months of 1944. Japan was losing the war. American forces were advancing across the Pacific, island by island, pushing toward the Japanese homeland. The Philippines, which Japan had occupied since 1942, were next. MacArthur had promised to return. That promise was about to be kept. In December 1944, Second Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, 22 years old, intelligence officer, was given his orders. He was to go to Lubang Island, a small piece of land southwest of Manila, and conduct guerrilla operations. His mission was to hamper enemy movements, gather intelligence, and survive. His commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, was explicit. "You're absolutely forbidden to die by your own hand. It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we'll come back for you. Until then, so long as you have one soldier, you are to continue to lead him. You may have to live on coconuts. If that's the case, live on coconuts. Under no circumstances are you to give up your life voluntarily." Onoda understood. This was not a suicide mission. This was a survival mission. He was to stay alive, stay operational, and wait for Japan to counterattack and retake the Philippines. It was a fantasy. Japan had no capacity to counterattack anything by December 1944. But Onoda didn't know that. He believed in the mission. He believed in ultimate victory. He arrived on Lubang Island on December 26, 1944, with 3 other soldiers: Corporal Shoichi Shimada, Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka, and Private Yuichi Akatsu. The 4 men were supposed to link up with a larger garrison and coordinate guerrilla operations. Instead, they found chaos. The Japanese forces on Lubang were already in retreat. American forces were landing. The local commander ordered a general withdrawal. Most Japanese troops fled to other islands or surrendered. Onoda and his 3 men refused to follow. They had their orders. They were to stay on Lubang and conduct guerrilla operations. Surrendering contradicted their mission. Retreating contradicted their mission. So they stayed. They moved into the mountains. They hid in the jungle. They watched as American forces secured the island, as the war moved past them, as 1944 became 1945. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast. The war was over. Leaflets were dropped over Lubang Island in Japanese, explaining that the war had ended. that all soldiers should surrender, that they would be treated fairly. Onoda and his men found the leaflets. They read them carefully. They concluded the leaflets were American propaganda. The reasoning was logical from their perspective. Japan did not surrender. The emperor was divine. Surrender was unthinkable. Therefore, these leaflets were obvious forgeries designed to trick Japanese soldiers into giving up. The leaflets were crudely printed, which reinforced the propaganda theory. Onoda noted that the language was slightly off, that certain phrases were not quite correct. He was right about that. The leaflets had been prepared by American psychological warfare units whose Japanese translators were good but not perfect. The imperfections convinced Onoda the leaflets were fake. In October 1945, Onoda's younger brother came to Lubang. He traveled with a search party, calling out to Hiroo through loudspeakers. "The war is over. Our family is waiting. Please come home." Onoda heard the broadcasts. He recognized his brother's voice. He did not respond. His logic was clear. If the Americans had created fake surrender leaflets, they could force captured Japanese civilians to make broadcasts. His brother could be speaking under duress, or it could be someone who sounded like his brother. The broadcasts could not be trusted. The four men continued their mission. They raided local farms for food. They stole rice, fruit, vegetables. They occasionally killed a cow for meat. They moved constantly, never staying in one location more than a few days. They built temporary shelters in the jungle, camouflaged and hidden. They maintained their weapons. They stayed ready for orders that would surely come. In 1949, Private Yuichi Akatsu left the group. 4 years in the jungle had broken his morale. He surrendered to Filipino authorities. He was repatriated to Japan. Before leaving, Akatsu tried to convince the others to surrender with him. He told them the war was truly over. He showed them newspapers. He explained that Japan was occupied by American forces, that the country was rebuilding, that the emperor himself had ordered all soldiers to lay down their arms. Onoda, Shimada, and Kozuka listened politely. Then they concluded that Akatsu had been broken by propaganda, that his surrender was evidence of weakness, that the information he provided was clearly false. How could Japan be occupied? How could the divine emperor order surrender? It was impossible. Akatsu was a deserter. His information was compromised. The 3 remaining men continued their mission. The desertion of Akatsu prompted the Japanese government to send another search mission in 1950. Letters from family members were brought to the island. Photographs were left in locations where the soldiers might find them. Loudspeakers broadcast messages. The search teams combed the jungle for weeks. They found signs of the soldiers, campsites, stolen food, footprints. But they never found the men themselves. Onoda had learned to evade searchers. He understood that anyone on the island could be the enemy. Filipino police were obviously the enemy, but even Japanese search parties could be compromised. The Americans controlled Japan now, according to the propaganda narrative. Therefore, any Japanese civilians on the island were probably working for the Americans. The safest course was to avoid all contact. The 3 men became ghosts. They moved through the jungle like shadows. They survived on stolen food, wild fruit, coconuts. They hunted small game. They maintained military discipline. They held formations. They conducted training exercises. They kept their rifles clean and operational despite the humidity and constant rain. They waited for orders. On May 7, 1954, Corporal Shoichi Shimada was killed. The 3 men had been attempting to steal rice from a fishing village near the coast. A group of Filipino fishermen spotted them. Shots were fired. Shimada was hit in the shoulder. The 3 men retreated into the jungle. Shimada's wound became infected. They had no antibiotics, no proper medical supplies. Shimada developed a fever. He died 3 days later. Onoda and Kozuka buried him in the jungle. They held a brief military funeral. They saluted his grave. Then they continued the mission. 2 men now, 9 years in the jungle, still waiting for orders. The death of Shimada prompted another search mission. The Japanese government sent Shimada's family members to Lubang. They broadcast messages. They left photographs and letters. They assured Onoda and Kozuka that the war was over, that Japan was at peace, that families were waiting. Onoda and Kozuka heard the broadcasts. They saw the photographs, which were left in waterproof bags at locations the searchers thought the soldiers might visit. They examined everything carefully. The photographs showed Japan as a modern, prosperous country. Buildings taller than anything that had existed in 1944. Cars everywhere. People dressed in Western clothing. The two soldiers concluded this was further proof of propaganda sophistication. The Americans had obviously created fake photographs using movie techniques. The broadcasts from family members were actors. The entire search operation was an elaborate trick. They continued the mission. The years passed. 1955, 1960, 1965. The two men aged in the jungle. They developed routines. They moved between a network of campsites hidden throughout the island's interior. They stole food several times per month, always from different locations to avoid patterns. They occasionally killed cattle belonging to local farmers. This was not cruelty. It was survival. They needed protein. They had no other source. The local population of Lubang came to fear the two soldiers. Stories circulated of Japanese ghosts in the mountains. Farmers were shot at when they ventured too deep into the jungle. Cattle disappeared. Rice stores were raided. The Philippine government sent police and military patrols to hunt the soldiers. These patrols failed. Onoda and Kozuka had perfected jungle survival. They could hear searchers coming from hundreds of meters away. They knew every trail, every hiding place, every escape route. They moved silently. They left no trace. They had become expert guerrillas, fighting a war that existed only in their minds. In 1965, the Japanese government made one more major effort. A search party of over 1,000 people combed Lubang Island. They brought family members. They broadcast messages constantly. They left supplies, letters, newspapers, photographs. The operation lasted 3 months. They found campsites. They found evidence. They never found the men. Onoda and Kozuka watched the searchers from hiding. They noted the scale of the operation. They were impressed by the resources being devoted to this propaganda effort. The Americans, they concluded, were very committed to eliminating the last resistance in the Philippines. The fact that such a large operation was necessary proved the mission was still important. If the war were truly over, why would anyone bother searching for two soldiers on a remote island? The search itself was evidence the war continued. On October 19, 1972, Kenshichi Kozuka was killed. The two men had been burning rice fields, attempting to deny resources to the enemy following guerrilla warfare doctrine. A Filipino patrol spotted smoke. They investigated. They encountered the two soldiers. Shots were exchanged. Kozuka was hit. He died almost immediately. Onoda retreated into the jungle alone. 27 years in the jungle. One man remaining, still on duty. Kozuka's death made international news. The Japanese soldier still fighting World War II in 1972 became a global story. Journalists came to Lubang. Television crews filmed reports from the island. The story was simultaneously tragic and absurd. One man, alone in the jungle, fighting a war that had ended before most of the journalists covering the story had been born. The Japanese government sent another search mission. Kozuka's family came to Lubang. They held a funeral. They broadcast messages to Onoda. They begged him to surrender. Onoda heard the broadcasts. He observed the funeral from a distance through binoculars he had maintained for 27 years. He saw Kozuka's family crying. He saw the Japanese flag. He saw what appeared to be genuine grief. For the first time, doubt crept in. But doubt was not certainty. His orders were clear. He would only surrender when ordered to do so by his commanding officer. Until then, the mission continued. One man now, but still a soldier, still on duty. This is when Norio Suzuki enters the story. Suzuki was 24 years old, a college dropout, an adventurer. He told friends he wanted to find 3 things: a panda, a yeti, and Lieutenant Onoda. Most people thought he was joking. He was not. Suzuki believed he could succeed where official search missions had failed because he had no official backing. He was not part of the government. He was not part of the military. He was just a young Japanese man who wanted to talk to Onoda as one Japanese person to another. In February 1974, Suzuki traveled to Lubang. He did not bring search parties or loudspeakers or official delegations. He simply went into the jungle and started camping in locations where Onoda might be. He left his tent open. He made fires. He left food out. He made himself visible and vulnerable. This was the opposite of every previous search strategy. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. Then, on March 9, 1974, Onoda walked into Suzuki's camp. He had been observing Suzuki for several days. This young man was different from the others. He was alone. He did not seem to be part of an official operation. He was acting strangely, almost carelessly. Onoda decided to make contact. The conversation lasted 4 days. Suzuki explained patiently everything that had happened since 1945. Japan had surrendered. The country had been occupied. The occupation had ended. Japan was now independent, democratic, prosperous. The emperor still lived. The war had ended 29 years ago. Onoda listened carefully. He asked detailed questions. He evaluated Suzuki's answers for signs of deception. He found none. Suzuki did not have the manner of someone reciting a prepared script. He spoke naturally. He made mistakes. He admitted when he did not know something. Most importantly, he was not trying to capture Onoda. He was just talking. For the first time in 29 years, someone was simply talking to Onoda as a person, not as a target. By the 4th day, Onoda had reached a conclusion. He believed Suzuki was telling the truth. The war was probably over. Japan had probably surrendered. Everything he had believed for 29 years was probably wrong. But belief was not enough. His orders were absolute. He could only surrender when ordered to do so by his commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. Suzuki asked if Onoda would surrender if Major Taniguchi came to Lubang and gave the order. Onoda confirmed, "If his commanding officer orders me to surrender, I will surrender immediately." Suzuki asked Onoda to wait. He would go to Japan. He would find Major Taniguchi. He would bring him to Lubang. Onoda agreed to wait. Suzuki left the jungle and flew back to Japan. He went immediately to the government. He explained what had happened. He asked for help finding Major Taniguchi. The government began searching. They found records showing that Major Taniguchi had survived the war. He had been discharged in 1945. He had returned to civilian life. He was now 51 years old, working as a bookseller in a small town. The government contacted Taniguchi. They explained the situation. They asked if he would go to Lubang and order Lieutenant Onoda to surrender. Taniguchi agreed immediately. On March 20, 1974, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi traveled to Lubang Island. He was accompanied by Suzuki, government officials, and journalists. They went to the location Suzuki had specified. They waited. Onoda appeared. He was 52 years old. He had spent 29 years, 3 months, and 5 days in the jungle. He had aged but remained physically fit, lean and muscular from decades of constant movement. He wore his uniform, patched and repaired countless times. He carried his rifle, still functional. He had his sword. He had maintained military bearing through 3 decades. Major Taniguchi stood before his former subordinate. The 2 men saluted. Taniguchi spoke formally, using military protocol. "Lieutenant Onoda, I'm ordering you to cease all military operations and surrender. The war is over. Japan has surrendered. Your mission is complete. You have served with honor. You are relieved of duty." Onoda saluted again. He stood at attention. His face showed no emotion. He said, "I understand. I will obey your orders." The formal surrender took place on March 21, 1974. Onoda wore his dress uniform, which he had preserved in a waterproof container for 29 years. He presented his sword to the Philippine government representative. He presented his rifle, which was still loaded and operational. He presented military documents, orders, his diary, which he had kept throughout his time in the jungle. He stood at attention while the Japanese national anthem played. Photographers captured the moment. Television cameras recorded it. The world watched as a man who had been fighting World War II in 1974 finally, formally, surrendered. Onoda returned to Japan as a celebrity. He landed at Haneda Airport to crowds of reporters and civilians. Some people treated him as a hero, a symbol of loyalty and dedication. Others viewed him with confusion or pity. The Japan he returned to was unrecognizable. In 1944, when he left, Japan was a militaristic empire. Cities were intact. The military dominated society. Traditional values were absolute. In 1974, Japan was a democratic, pacifist, economic powerhouse. Tokyo was a modern metropolis of skyscrapers and neon. Young people wore Western clothes and listened to rock music. Women worked in offices. The emperor was a constitutional figurehead. Everything had changed. Onoda struggled to adjust. The modern world felt alien. The abundance was overwhelming. The pace was too fast. The values were incomprehensible. Young people seemed disrespectful. No one followed military discipline. The society felt soft, weak, lacking in purpose. He gave interviews. He wrote a book about his experience. He tried to explain what it had been like to live in 1944 for 29 years, to fight a war that everyone else had forgotten, to hold on to duty when the rest of the world had moved on. Most people could not understand. How do you explain absolute loyalty to someone who has never experienced it? How do you explain following orders for 3 decades when the society around you has abandoned the concept of unquestioning obedience? The Philippine government debated whether to charge Onoda with crimes. He had killed between 30 and 100 Filipino civilians during his time in the jungle. Estimates varied. He had destroyed property. He had terrorized communities. Under Philippine law, these were crimes regardless of whether Onoda believed he was following orders. But President Ferdinand Marcos issued a pardon. He recognized that Onoda had genuinely believed he was acting as a soldier following orders. Charging him would serve no purpose. The Filipino families who had lost members to Onoda's actions were less forgiving. Some accepted the pardon, others did not. One farmer whose brother had been killed by Onoda said, "He was following orders. I understand that, but my brother is still dead. Both things are true." Onoda himself expressed regret, but not quite apology. In interviews he said, "I did what I believed was my duty as a soldier. If I caused suffering, I regret that suffering, but I cannot apologize for following orders. I was a soldier. I did my duty." This attitude troubled many people. It suggested Onoda had learned nothing, that he would do it all again if ordered. Perhaps that was true. Perhaps absolute loyalty once formed cannot be unlearned. In 1975, Onoda left Japan. He moved to Brazil and became a cattle rancher. He said he could not live in modern Japan. The country had become too different. The values he had fought to preserve no longer existed. In Brazil, he found space, quiet, distance from a world that had moved past him. He married. He ran his ranch. He lived quietly for decades. In 1984, he returned to Japan and founded a nature school for young people. He wanted to teach survival skills, self-reliance, discipline. The school was moderately successful. Some parents appreciated the traditional values. Others were uncomfortable with Onoda's philosophy, which emphasized obedience and sacrifice in ways that seemed outdated or even dangerous. Onoda returned to Lubang Island one final time in 1996. He was 74 years old. He came to donate $10,000 to the local school, an acknowledgement of the suffering he had caused. He met with families of people he had killed. Some accepted his gesture, others did not. He visited the places where he had lived in the jungle. His campsites were overgrown, the trails had disappeared, the island had moved on. He stood in the jungle and said to reporters, "This place was my whole world for so long. Now it is just jungle again. Nothing remains. Everything changes except the jungle." Onoda died on January 16, 2014 at age 91. His obituaries struggled to define his legacy. Was he a hero, a fanatic, a victim of indoctrination, a symbol of loyalty, a warning about the dangers of unquestioning obedience? He was probably all of these things. His story raised questions that have no comfortable answers. What does it mean to follow orders when those orders lead to decades of pointless violence? What is the value of loyalty when the cause is lost? When does dedication become delusion? When does duty become destruction? Onoda believed he was doing his duty. He followed his orders with absolute commitment. He survived impossible conditions through discipline and will. From one perspective, he was the perfect soldier. From another perspective, he wasted 29 years of his life fighting a war that ended before he began. He killed people for a cause that had already surrendered. He caused suffering that served no purpose. Both perspectives are true. The contradiction is the point. Onoda's commanding officer, Major Taniguchi, gave an interview in 1995. He was asked if he felt responsible for what Onoda had done, for the 29 years in the jungle, for the deaths. Taniguchi said, "I gave him an order. He followed that order. As a soldier, that is what he was supposed to do. As a human being, I wish he had understood sooner that the war was over. But I cannot blame him for following orders I gave. The responsibility is mine." This answer satisfied no one. It was too simple for something so complex. But perhaps that is the only answer possible. Orders were given, orders were followed. Consequences resulted. Responsibility is shared but not equal. Everyone involved was trapped in a system that valued obedience over reason, duty over compassion, loyalty over life. The question that haunted Onoda for the rest of his life was simple and unanswerable. What if I had surrendered in 1945? What if I had believed the leaflets? What if I had listened to my brother? What if I had trusted Akatsu when he deserted? What if I had accepted that the war was over? 29 years of my life was spent in that jungle. Shimada and Kozuka died there. People on Lubang died because of me. What if I had just surrendered? He asked this question in interviews. He asked it in his book. He never found an answer that satisfied him. The closest he came was this: I followed my orders. A soldier must follow orders. If I had surrendered without orders, I would have been a deserter. I would have betrayed my duty. I would have dishonored myself and my family. I could not do that. So I stayed. It was the only choice I could make. This logic is both perfect and terrible. Perfect because within its own framework, it is completely consistent. Terrible because it justifies decades of suffering based on orders that should have been questioned the moment circumstances changed. But how do you teach a soldier to question orders when you have spent years teaching him never to question? How do you tell someone to think for themselves when you have trained them to obey without thinking? The military requires obedience. Combat requires following orders even when those orders might get you killed. You cannot build an army on soldiers who evaluate every command and decide whether to obey. But you also cannot build a society on people who never question authority, who follow orders regardless of consequences, who value loyalty over humanity. The contradiction is built into the system. Onoda lived in that contradiction for 91 years. His story became a metaphor. In Japan, he was used by conservatives to criticize modern society's lack of discipline and loyalty. He was used by liberals to criticize blind obedience and militarism. Both sides claimed him. Neither understood him. Onoda himself rejected both interpretations. In a late interview, he said, "I am not a symbol. I'm just a man who followed orders. Do not make me into something I am not. Do not use my life to support your arguments. I did what I did. That is all." But of course, his life became symbolic anyway. You cannot spend 29 years fighting a war that ended 3 decades earlier without becoming a symbol of something. The only question was what? In the end, perhaps the most important thing about Hiroo Onoda's story is not what it symbolizes, but what it reveals about human capacity. The capacity to endure impossible conditions. The capacity to maintain purpose in the absence of reason. The capacity to survive when survival seems pointless. The capacity to follow orders even when those orders lead nowhere. These capacities are simultaneously admirable and horrifying. They show human willpower at its absolute extreme. They also show the danger of willpower, untethered from judgment. Onoda survived in the jungle for 29 years because he never questioned whether he should. He simply did. That determination kept him alive. It also kept him trapped in a war that everyone else had left behind. When Norio Suzuki found Onoda in 1974, he asked him one question that Onoda could never adequately answer. "Why did you stay for so long?" Onoda's answer was always the same. "I had my orders. I was waiting for further orders." A soldier waits, but Suzuki pressed. "Did you never doubt? Did you never question? Did you never wonder if maybe, possibly, the war was actually over?" Onoda admitted, "Yes, I doubted. Many times. Especially after Kozuka died. I was alone. I thought perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps the war was over. Perhaps I should surrender. But then I would remember my orders. Major Taniguchi told me to wait. He said it might take 3 years or 5 years, but they would come back. He ordered me to survive. So I survived. I waited. That was my duty." Suzuki said, "But it was 29 years. Onoda replied, "Yes, it was 29 years. That does not change the orders." This exchange reveals everything about Onoda's psychology. He was not insane. He was not incapable of questioning. He simply valued duty over doubt. When the two came into conflict, duty won, every time, for 29 years. That is the story of Hiroo Onoda. A man who fought World War II until 1974, not because he did not know it had ended, but because he was never ordered to stop. A man who survived impossible conditions because he refused to give up. A man who killed people and destroyed lives because he believed he was following orders. A man who wasted 3 decades of his life because he valued loyalty over reason. A man who became a symbol of both dedication and delusion. A man who was simultaneously a hero and a tragedy. In March 1974, when Major Taniguchi ordered Onoda to surrender, Onoda stood at attention and said, "I will obey." Then he asked one question: "Did Japan win the war?" Taniguchi answered, "No, Japan lost." Onoda was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I see. I understand." He never asked another question. He had his answer. The war was lost. His 29 years in the jungle had served no strategic purpose. Japan had surrendered without him. His loyalty had changed nothing. But he had followed his orders. He had done his duty. He had survived. That, in the end, was all he could claim. It had to be enough because it was all he had.